but how remained a mystery he kept largely to himself. He refused to discuss the people who had died or what he had shared with the men who had survived. "It was a long, cold night," the Edmonton Journal quoted him as saying shortly after the crash. "We talked about things, private things I'd rather not discuss." "He has nightmares," was all my mother would say. In the months and years following the crash, my father forged extraordinary bonds with his fellow survivors, especially Paul Archambault, the 27-year-old criminal on the plane. Every so often, the scruffy drifter would arrive unannounced. No matter how busy my father's schedule was, he always had time for Paul. My dad would talk about these meetings with delight and obvious affection. Their relationship was important to him in a way I never fully understood. He cared deeply about how Paul's life was progressing and worried during his long absences, as a father would for an itinerant son. After one visit, my dad spoke enthusiastically about a dog-eared sheaf of papers that Paul had brought with him, a manuscript he was writing about his experience that night. My dad also kept in touch with Erik Vogel, the young pilot who had flown the plane. Every year on the anniversary of the crash, Dad would call him to talk about how lucky they were to be alive. Erik had been just 24, 2 years older than I was at the time when the crash occurred. Years later, though juggling the demands of parenthood and my own business, I felt compelled to seek him out. I found him working in a nearby city as a firefighter and living with his family on a quiet tract of land less than an hour's drive from my home. I arranged a meeting and drove out to Erik's farm. The former pilot's first words to me were, "I've been waiting years for you." Over coffee in his kitchen, within sight of a solid wood butcher block table on loan from Scott Deschamps, the fourth crash survivor, Erik shared his story. Though almost 20 years had passed since the ordeal, he cried as he recounted the events of that night. They had never left him, nor had his burden of guilt over the deaths of 6 passengers. When I drove away hours later, I carried his dust-covered leather flight bag, a tote the size of a small suitcase in which he had filed away his pilot logbook, years of airline rejection letters, court documents, photos, and every newspaper clipping he had seen about the tragedy or those involved. Sifting through the contents of Erik's flight bag was like opening the door to a lost world. All of a sudden, an event that had seemed surreal came into sharp, dramatic focus. My dad, it turned out, was not the only one to have been transfigured by what happened that long ago night. Joseph Campbell, the American mythologist who coined the phrase, "follow your bliss," wrote extensively about man's quest for meaning. According to Campbell, all heroic journeys, from the time of the ancients to the present day, begin with a call to adventure, a challenge or opportunity to face the unknown and gain something of physical or spiritual value. This call often comes in the form of a transformative crisis, an event that kicks out our foundations of complacency and makes us examine universal questions of existence. Why was I born? What happens when I die? How can I overcome my fears and weaknesses and be happy? Few of us will ever face the kind of life and death trauma experienced by the men in this story. Their ordeal forced them to confront the precious and limited nature of their existence on Earth. In the words of Campbell, they entered the forest at the darkest point where there is no path. How these 4 men found their way forward that night and in the years that followed is both remarkable and inspirational. Scott Deschamps, the rookie RCMP officer who had boarded the flight handcuffed to Paul Archambault, was no exception. Unlike Erik, however, it took me 3 years to persuade Scott to be interviewed. Perhaps more than any of the survivors, he had deliberately, painstakingly rebuilt his life as a result of his experience. His resistance to